Uh, it's city life.
Yeah, ne?
Busy. Okay, we're going live now. Okay.
All right.
Research remains an important part of any society to grow, finding solutions, finding sustainable solutions. However, there are techniques to this process that one needs to follow. My name is Isasipingo Simtingi, and I am your host here at the Young Researchers Hub, where science and the public become one. Today, we're having an interesting conversation with Mr. Ngalo, interrogating, or rather, him taking us through into what is research methodology and how do you choose a research method. And this is an interesting conversation because I think a lot of people find themselves stretching their heads when it comes to this point as to how do you choose your research methodology and how do you choose your method? And today we're having this conversation with Mr. Ngalo, which is we're happy to have him. And Mr. Ngalo is a PhD candidate at the State University of New York at Buffalo, a Fulbright scholarship in educational culture, policy, and society in the School of Education, Leadership, and Policy. Prior to pursuing his PhD, he received academic training in public administration, master's at the University of Port Alice, studying legislative frameworks that govern how different bodies of government operate, the analytical lenses with which to critically interrogate education funding policy and its underlying assumption. His work experience is largely concentrated in educational research, but has recently done broad research analysis for research consultancy. For me personally, I met Kanye at Sinempumelelo Reading Club, where we were reading for kids, helping them how to read, and just basically it has always been about education from his side as far as I've known him, for the years I've known him. Thank you, Kanye, for giving us your time and coming through to the Young Researchers Hub. This is a small community that is growing where we discuss mainly what is research, what are the techniques, people getting a platform to share their research findings based on the research they conducted. And as this family, we welcome you today. Welcome to the Young Researchers Hub.
Thank you, Isa. Thank you for the great introduction and also for allowing me to kind of present on your platform. Warm welcome to your audience. I'm seeing several people have joined us. Apologies for the lighting. She says Lalini, so if you have any connection to that, you will know that, like, we have infrastructural challenges that we have, but nonetheless, we here. I'm helped by a colleague of mine with lighting, at least just so that people can see me. I hope this talk will be useful to people. I did share to Isa that, like, I'm trying as much as possible to make this informal and just to make sure that, like, people can take a lot from this. So I really look forward to the Q&A session. Yeah, we can kind of get into the details of it. So I'll share with you guys my my screen. Just let me know if you could see my screen from your end.
All right, I'll let you know. And we have some people on Facebook that have joined us. So we're having a community on both sides.
Oh, okay, yes, awesome. Hi to you all on Facebook. Yeah, so I think also before kind of getting into this, I'm going to share with you guys. Wait, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So there's some books that I recommend for people. There's a lot of different spaces where you can get a lot of very useful material. So you'll see there I have research methodology books. So there's the coding manual for quantitative researchers by Johnny Saldana. So for people who have more of a qualitative inclination, they could look more into that. And I think later on, we'll be kind of getting into what is coding when you're doing research. So that's definitely one book to kind of look at, it will teach you things you won't learn in class, because a lot of academics, there's a lot of things that they're not comfortable telling you that they don't know how to do because they're still figuring it out themselves. But that's one book to look at if you want to get an edge in terms of making sure that in terms of sharpening your research skills, you where you need to be. Okay, so that's for qualitative researchers, people who have that inclination. And then we have the second one, research methods for everyday life, blending qualitative and quantitative approaches. Because some people, rather than going qualitative or quantitative, they want to do mixed methods, you know. And one of the things people won't tell you when you're doing your master's or honors, or even PhD, in fact, is that like, and as much as people say they're advocates of mixed methods, it's not a perfect science. A lot of people don't get it right. There's actually a lot of journals that talk about research methods actually fight a lot in terms of, you know, like people not doing it right. But that's something we can get into later, or we can even talk about in the Q&A session. But before just kind of getting into all of this, I just want to say to people that the main thing to remember as we get into research methodologies, or even what method you could use, you know, the main thing to remember is that like it's a systematic process, you know. So research is, as you know, by definition, is a systematic design and implementation of research. So from the point of conception, when you were designing, collecting, organizing, and analyzing your data, it's a systematic process, okay? So that's at the core of what we'll be talking about today. So what does that look like? What does it entail? What are some of the things you should be thinking about? And then before you even get into the details of which methods, you know, like, should I go qualitative or quantitative? First, remember, there is, you know, one of my favorite writers, Ngalo, who's from Trinidad, but based in Toronto. He's a musician, he's a rapper. But one of the things that he said that was very important to me in his mixtape series, he was talking about there is no community without communication. And I think the same applies to research. So whatever method you're going to use, whatever methodology you're going to use, always think about that there's a community of, you know, scholars, you know, there's existing bodies of knowledge that predate our existence, that have laid the ground for whatever research we're going to pursue. So that's always important to think that you're communicating to an audience, just like how to think about, okay, you know, coming to the Young Researchers Hub, I need to think about, some people maybe more seasoned researchers, but we moving in that direction of trying to be seasoned researchers, we aspiring researchers, some people doing their masters and so forth. So it's always important to think about your audience. So with that said, I think there are two main things that guide which methodology you're going to use, right? So the most obvious things, I mean, there's paradigms, right? There's the qualitative paradigm, you know, which is kind of saying we want to understand, regardless of what topic you choose, whether you in the social sciences or natural sciences, regardless of the topic you choose, you want to understand what meanings the people ascribe to whatever phenomena you're trying to understand. So whether it's you know, teachers, whether in the rural, peri-urban, or urban areas, you know, like how do they experience the use of instructional time? That's just an example, you know, like you're not trying to quantify you know, the timetable that they use they use the first period like this and so forth. So that's the qualitative side. You're not trying to ascribe numbers, statistics to people's experiences. It's more the meaning, you know, what meaning do people give to these things? So that's the one paradigm. And then the other, obviously, is the quantitative, which is more concerned about the numbers now. Like you're trying to understand frequencies. How often do people do this, that, you know? And it takes different forms, as I'll be getting into it. There's descriptive statistics, there's inferential statistics. We can get into that. But like each of these also have their own language, you know, like they also tell you like what are these people's worldviews, you know? So to have a qualitative research approach means that people co-construct their reality, like the structural and agency debates, whether you say a structure that determines people's realities or it's the people's agency, like their ability to say like, no, I'm going to make my own reality, like we see with a lot of self-help books and what they're selling to people. I hope I'm not going too fast for people. Are we still on board?
Yes, we're still
Okay.
here. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, okay, I can talk a bit fast sometimes. Okay, no, that's cool. So yeah, so with that, you're more concerned with meaning, outside of numbers and frequencies and so forth. Whereas with quantitative, it's a completely different worldview. You feel like the world is observable, is measured, everything to do with numbers. Like we can count how many times a teacher reference a particular textbook if that's what we're looking at. I'll make these examples because, like Issa was saying in my introduction, I come from an educational background, even though I'm trained in public administration, dealing with legislative frameworks and so forth. So those are the two different paradigms and their worldviews. So your question of whether what method to use rests largely on your question. So you could be studying the same thing, but your question could come from a completely different point. If you try to understand the meaning people ascribe, or the meanings that people ascribe to your particular topic, then you're obviously using a qualitative lens. As you can see here in the PowerPoint, the power of question, we talk about choosing the appropriate, it says coding method here because that's what I eventually want to get into more detail with people, because I feel like that's what will help you with your dissertation, your thesis, and possibly even getting a cum laude, because it's one of those things that are not taught well. And I'm saying this is someone who's, been through institutions of learning and see the pitfalls of it. So choosing your method will depend on your type of question, right? So there's different types of questions, and you can see here there's more exploratory questions, which are research questions that are more open-ended, and I'll give you an example of those. So if I'm saying to you, how do teachers narrate and reflect upon policy-regulated instructional time used in classrooms in the times of COVID-19 regulations in teaching and learning? Sorry for that. My phone is ringing. Sorry, guys. But like that's one example, right? And then we have more confirmatory questions, which are close-ended. And you find a lot of these in quantitative research. And those would be like what questions, as you see next, right? Yes, okay. So these are, and I mean, as you know, quantitative research, like I said, deals a lot with numbers, with observable measures, right? And then you have different statistics there. You have descriptives, which regardless of what you do, and you can't run away from descriptive statistics. And that has to do with, the people you gave surveys to, because like a lot of quantitative research uses surveys. And I mean, there's obviously experimental research, which we can talk about. I don't know if in the audience, the people who do STEM fields, if they are, I can just say yes or no, then I can kind of get into that, because I want to make sure that we use our time very efficiently. If there isn't, I can kind of just go through them briefly rather than delve into something that won't serve anyone in our audience. Isa, you kind of let me know. I'm just kind of moving between the presentation and just trying to see people's responses.
Okay, no, I'll definitely let you know if there's any response either here or on Facebook.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So with descriptors, you can't run away from them. You're trying to understand, okay, in terms of the people you gave a survey to, are they white? Are they black? You want to try to understand the racial spread of the people. Are they male, female, however it is they identify. It's those kind of demographic profiles that you're trying to set up so that by the time you get into the details of so many people do this, you already know who you're dealing with. Okay, so that's what that serves. So with any research project, you kind of have to get into that. Even when you're doing qualitative research, by the way, you might not get into the hard numbers that statisticians have to deal with, but like you have to give a profile of the people who are part of your study. And then if inferential statistics, now you're looking at more correlation and regression, right? And then this is where what I was saying earlier about where you land your research methods depends on your question. So with correlation, you're trying to understand how are two variables related, you know? You're not trying to understand what is the impact of A on B, but you're just trying to understand what kind of relationship exists there. Is it negative or positive? That's what correlation is, without being too scientific and getting, you know, stuck in terminology. That's what correlation is. And the language, how you get to pick up, how you get to know if you're going to use correlation or not, is in the language again, right? So I'll use keywords people use when they're doing a correlation, right? You use words like, what is the associative relationship between use of instructional, I'm just using an example now, use of instructional time and its impact on teacher performance. Let's say you were looking at that, right? So it's about the link, association. So whenever you see those words, those are keywords, link, association, that's when you know you're doing correlation, right? But now when you're saying, so regression has much to do with impact. What is the impact of instructional time on learner performance? So you want to know the amount of time that teachers spend providing instruction for learners and how that affects their outcomes. Affect, impact, influence, so many other words you can think of, but the relationship is very specific. You can't mistake it for correlation. It's the effect, impact, influence of one thing over the other. So I'm not going to drown that, but that's, so in terms of really how you choose your method, I think people have a sense now. However it is you formulate your question, whether you say, how do people narrate, you know you're in the qualitative side of the spectrum. If you're saying, what is the impact of A on B, you know you're looking at quantitative, but more specifically regression. If you're saying, what is the associative link, association between A and B, you know you're still looking at the quantitative, but more you're looking at correlation. So you won't be expected to do the heavy stats that people who doing structural equation models have to do. And we can kind of get into structural equation models in the next few minutes. So I'm seeing that we have about 8 minutes. I'm not trying to stretch this way over time, but it's just trying to lay the land in terms of people trying to understand, well, what is my question and where does it land me in terms of the research I need to do? Everything else, like I said, I gave you examples of research books you can look at. That's easy stuff. I mean, like you have dissertations, you have theses that you can look to as points of reference in terms of what to put in there. Like, and you know, academics can be a bit anal about certain things, but like as long as you just know that, like, because of how you framed your question, you're doing correlation, regression, everything else you can get either from previous journals to know, okay, if I'm trying to understand the relationship between these two particular things, let me look at research other people have done. What scales that they use? So if you're using quantitative research, then that would be where you would go. What scales did they use? I recently had a client who was interested in social media use in the workplace. So there you will find that there's SIM scales, which look at motivation, like why do people have an intrinsic motivation to to use social media for work or not, you know? And they have obviously scales kind of look for, like you have different scales, you have Likert scales, you have agreement scales that say whether people are most familiar with those, strongly agree, disagree, and so forth. The journal articles you can refer to, so I'm kind of basically giving you the script, guys. So the journal articles you could refer to would be looking at those kinds of things, and you would look at what, in terms of validity, what percentages are good for you to say, okay, this is a good scale or not. You know, that's quantitative, the quantitative side, right? Quantitative research, just to be out there with people, you know, because like people feel that's the more difficult, and others say no, quality is the more easy. It's just different ways of doing things. But what I will emphasize is that with quantitative research, the conventions are pretty set, you know, and that's why I'm saying to people that you can look to journal articles, you can look to books to find the stuff, like what scales to use, if you're looking at certain variables, and what is considered acceptable as a measure of reliability or validity. Those things are pretty, you can get those in any textbook. But the main thing that will serve you well is to understand this very basic information, because I feel like it is sometimes not well explained to people. Noticing that there's 5 more minutes, so I kind of gotten a bit more into the quantitative side because I feel like that's where people are less inclined to go to. But in as far as qualitative research, you know, like in terms of methods, like people usually go for interviews, and I mean, even there, they're different. The most commonly used one is semi-structured interviews because people feel that it gives them a bit of flexibility, kind of going to move a bit away from, sorry, so I'm going to stop share so that we can kind of go back into the conversation, because we're kind of concluding and getting back into what's up. So with qualitative research, you have semi-structured interviews. They're a bit more flexible. You can probe as you move along because you have a set questions that you have set forward in your protocol, in your interview protocol, and then everything you kind of probe as people give you stuff, because there's certain things that you just can't foresee. And as much as people, you know, try and pretend that research is a perfect science, but you'll always be surprised, you know. People will say certain things and take you into directions you'd never foreseen. So that's one method that people usually use. And there's focus groups, of course, that people use. And just on the note of focus groups, like I know it's one of those things people would like to say just to tick boxes, you know, to say like, hey, you know, I did interviews, I did focus groups. You don't just do focus intergroups. You don't just do focus groups interviews, right? There's a method to it. And the method is this. It's a cumulative process. So it comes second to doing individual interviews. That's what I would say. And you base who you're going to put in your focus group based on what you find in your individual interviews. So for example, if you see that there's a huge difference between males and females and how they're talking about their experiences, then you would want to put those experiences in the same room. That's the whole point of doing a focus group interview. It's something that's not said often, but I feel like it's an important thing to highlight. So we kind of spoken about semi-structured interviews. Everything else you want to know about the advantages and disadvantages of that, you can always find in a research textbook. But like, I feel just for people to know, going into an honors, going into a master's, going into a PhD, these are some of the things to think about in terms of those two particular methods. Semi-structured interviews can never go wrong with those. Like, I feel like if you're doing qualitative research, it's always a go-to place. But just with focus groups, take in mind what I've said. You don't just want to put people in a room just so that you can tick a box and say, you did focus group interviews. And one last thing to add on focus group interviews. So you want to make sure, and as much as you bringing these two different experiences in the same room, you kind of, wherever it is they meet, wherever the points of contentions are, that's where you probe gently, of course. I mean, obviously, depending on what you research and considering topics can be traumatic to just probe, but like you want to probe that so that you whatever questions you're asking, then when these people are in the same room, you solicit responses that you wouldn't otherwise get if you were interviewing the people face to face, one on one. That's really the main thing. So that's it in terms of methodology, but also trying to understand what would work well for your research. And I mean, other people who are doing ethnography is going to observations. So I've done classroom observations in the field of education. So that's one other method you could use, but also as well, with those, you have to take field notes, but you don't just take field notes and abstraction. You need to know what are your variables of interest. And on that note, because I've reached my 30 minutes, but in closing, one method I would advise for people, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, always look, you don't want to be, I mean, obviously you have your own inclination, right? I'm trained in mixed methods, but I have a strong inclination to do qualitative research. But what I always advise people is this: if you're doing qualitative research, because quantitative conventions are so straightforward, look at research people are doing in your area of interest, look at the variables that they're looking at, and that's the easier way than to cover out what you want to do. So if you're looking at, I'll go back again to the point about social media usage, because I was working with the client and that. If you're looking at social media usage, and you see that the variables of interest, looking at motivation and job satisfaction, then your point will then be, okay, it's COVID-19. People are forced to use technology to work. So, you need to draw out other questions that are less obvious than the tick box questions you'd get from quantitative research, that allow you to be able to tell, are people really using technology because they want to, or because they're forced to, because that's the situation right now, So quantitative research would tell you the scales, what questions they're asking, but qualitative research then allows you to draw out things that go beyond whether people strongly disagree with things, but that tells you more about the meanings that they ascribe to these different things. I hope that's clear as an approach to think about as you do your research. I feel there's not a lot more I can say about observation, except that you need to have a very focal point of view in terms of what are you trying to hone in on. Which is the most obvious thing in education. Like if you're doing classroom observations, for example, are you looking at the teacher to understand what they're doing well or what they're not doing well? If you're trying to understand what they're doing well, what are the parameters of that? Are you trying to understand the lesson planning? Are you trying to understand how they distribute time? There's so many different things. So then what you observe will be based off those different things. But to even know that, then you'll have to look at literature and understand your area of research quite well. I hope that's clear. I'd like to open this particular moment for maybe questions, because then we can kind of get into maybe things that are not so obvious. I see that there's a hand, Umbali. But from me, that's mainly it. Because other things people can get from textbooks, and we don't want to waste people's time on the textbook stuff. Yeah.
No.
To you, Isa. I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Kanye. You've said a lot of things that have raised a lot of questions to me. Because as I mentioned, no, I'll first give everyone and then ask the questions I have and the questions that have been sent through. You mentioned a lot of things that I think even the textbook don't tell us. Which is, I'm happy that you've approached it in a way that you talk about things that we won't find in a textbook. Because when I was doing my research, also I'll
Oh,
go
thank you.
on YouTube, I'll read a book, but I've never, in the things I've seen, I've never came across a explanation that when I'm choosing my research methodology, it's more in line with what my questions are. And which is now, as you're saying, I'm like, I wonder if I chose right then in my research methodology, looking at my question.
Yeah,
Because now
I
I've
feel
already
you.
done my master's and I'm certainly not sure if I was on the right track because I've never thought that those two go together. But I'm gonna go to Mbali now and I'm gonna allow
Okay,
people to send to have their questions. You can raise your hands if you want to have a question, and then after that, I'll push in the questions I have on my side and some of the questions that have been sent. But I'll first give the floor to the people here on Zoom and people that are on Facebook.
okay,
Mbali, the
cool.
floor
Thank
is yours.
you.
Greetings, greetings, good evening. Thank you so much, sir, for the insightful presentation. My question is
My
to say,
pleasure.
in this day and age, when one is compiling a questionnaire, why is race still considered important? You know, when you look, you mentioned about descriptive statistics. So why is race still important in this day and age? Is it something that you don't have to include when you're compiling a questionnaire? Or is it sort of mandatory? So do we have leeway in terms of including race in our questionnaires?
Right, right. Thank you for that question. Yeah, like it depends. Like I said, it depends what your study is. Like, so I'll give you an example. If you like, in the States, there's a lot of people are talking about relationship between disciplinary measures in schools and the punitive system as it relates to juveniles, so like this is what they would call the school to prison pipeline. Okay, so a lot of people, there's a lot of back and forth between people whether the disciplinary measures that teachers are using in schools are funneling students into the juvenile system, right? So already you see that, going back to a point about our questions, that like there's a relationship you're trying to understand. Are disciplinary measures that are taking place in school funneling learners into the juvenile system? Already you can approach that from, like I said, from a quantitative perspective. You can look at correlation. What is the relationship between these two things? But more to your question, right? So if I'm looking at that through a critical race lens, you know what I'm saying? You kind of run away from race. Race is important because you're trying to understand, in terms of distribution now, who is being funneled into the juvenile system? Is it students of color? Are they white? Are they? And you actually find in the penal system that that students of color constitute a high proportion of students who've been funneled into the system or who are put into, like, detention classes and so forth. And that has profound implications for their futures. So race in that sense becomes an important thing to look at. It depends on your question. It depends what you're looking at. If you're not trying to track demographic shifts as they relate to race, then I don't feel it's an important thing to add. Yeah. So that's the I have a long answer, but I feel like that's the short end of it, because the long end of it is, as you design your questionnaire, obviously you don't just design it. It's drawn from literature, it's drawn from literature based on your question as well. So that's my answer to your question. I could say more, but I don't know. Maybe that's maybe all you wanted. I don't know.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I just felt that in this day and age, we're living in a democratic country. So one often feels when you see these questions, it's as if it's propagating or advocating racial discrimination, or, so that's why I often feel that is it really important to edit when it comes to research now? Is it still needed?
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
I'm
Sorry, can you tell me what's your research interest or area that you're investigating?
There isn't specifically one at the moment, even though my specialty is entrepreneurship. But at the moment, no, there isn't one that I'm looking at specifically. But I thought it's
okay. Right. So it depends. So just based off what you're saying, like it just depends on what you're interested in. Let's say, for example, you're trying to understand in terms of entrepreneurship, right? There's been like all of these different initiatives like that are trying to get people into entrepreneurship, youth empowerment, and so forth. If you were trying to track the racial composition of people who are into entrepreneurship, that it will be a useful thing to look at. It will be a useful thing to look at in the context of BE because it has such a strong emphasis on race. You know what I'm saying? But I do get what you're saying. Don't do it just for the sake of, because another study used it and you just want to tick a box. But you obviously want to use it in a way that allows you to really delve into the meat of your research and say something profound with your research. I appreciate the question. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it is. It is. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, my pleasure, Mbali. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Just to add on what you were saying, Kanye, I think also Mbali, most of the time, looking at South Africa and its young democracy, most of the things that we're trying to probe on, kind of to a certain way, pushes us into looking into the inequalities, and mostly inequalities in South Africa are as a result of race. So, for example, even on my study, it was in education, but one way or another, my question was around issues of inequality. So it looks at former white school and black schools. So even with that moment, there's already race. So sometimes I think it's not because people are trying to push in a certain narrative, but because of our state as a country looking 27 years into democracy, most people still feel, or rather statistics or research still show that there's large inequality between the different races. And I think that's also what influences sometimes our research questions. Interestingly, you mentioning the issue of BE, Kanye, you find out that sometimes the minority races feel excluded when it comes to business because of their race. And those are some of the probes that people are having. That maybe you would probe that, is their way of feeling justified looking at the country's status. So again, you're looking at issues of race. So I think the issue of race always comes up because of the country's history, and because we're still battling into trying to find a balance because of our history. So can you now? I'll push in some questions.
Sure. Go right
The
ahead.
first question. The first question I have. Oh, before I do that, I want to acknowledge someone who's here from a very senior government department, the executive director of sector support and analysis division, Mr. Benjamin, in the Tshwane city of Tshwane. Thank you very much, sir, for joining in.
Cool.
It's very much appreciated to see our government
Salutations,
officials
Mr. Benjamin.
investing investing on research. We know how people have been feeling about government and research, and it's very much appreciated, so that you take this time and join us. As I was saying, Kanye, you mentioned something, and I feel like going back to my master's and just starting all over again, because I feel like I was robbed when I was doing my master's. I came across the issue of variables when I was doing my master's, and I try to understand what is the whole issue around variables. How do you choose which part of whatever that you're researching about will be a variable? And because people will mention vertical, horizontal, it seemed more confusing. As a result, I think to a certain extent I've just shied away from it because I was under pressure. I needed to do my research. I needed to write and finish on time. And there was just in time to acquaint myself into research. So I would love that you explain as thorough as you can on what do you look at when you're taking this, when you're choosing these variables, and what are really variables when you're doing your research, and what is vertical, what is and all of that, like the whole confusing thing. In its
Okay.
simplest way.
Okay, no, cool. Yeah, I mean, whenever you mention the word variables, you just know you're talking quantitative research already, like that's kind of where we are, okay? So, but it's another way of saying, just like even if you're doing qualitative research, you might not say it's variables, right? But we'll kind of get into what that is. But like you're kind of looking at two things, the relationship between two things. And in quantitative research specifically, so they'll use the word variables, but also because these things are sometimes abstract, okay? But you're trying to understand there's what you call independent variables and dependent variables. So the dependent variables is usually the one that's at the far end of things, right? Depending on how complex your model is or your question is, because you could be looking at other mediating factors, for example, right? So if there are mediating factors, it means it's not just there's A and B, but there's something in between that helps you understand why the outcome at C is the way it is. So the thing in the middle kind of plays a buffer as a buffering effect, you know? So your dependent variable being the thing that, I don't know if people are looking at my head. So like, I'm trying to understand the relationship between these two variables. Like this is the most simplest way I can describe it. So this would be your independent first. So you'd be saying, let's say in this case, you're looking at time, right? As CAPS allocates time in people's timetables, and then you're looking at the educational outcomes, right? The grade, and you could measure that by grades and so forth, right? So that's the thing about variables. So like in itself, it's just a name, but it's a question of, are you using grades to measure outcome? What are you using, okay? So, but you're trying to understand the relationship between these two things. That's really what the relationship, it gets more complex depending on what your question is and what it's considering. So if you start saying, for example, looking at the intermediary role of teachers as people who enact policy and facilitate time use in class and the effect of that on learners' outcomes, it gets more complicated. That's when now you start having a model that's saying this is time, this is how teachers use it, this is the outcome, right? But you have different scales to kind of say, you know, people talk about Cronbach alpha, or basically if you think about, go back to our language about influence or impact, right? This, like, so if you're talking about time, what is its impact in classroom use and how it affects outcomes at the end of the day? So that's really it, but it depends on your research and what your variables could look different depending on your research. And sometimes it's not as simple as saying what you call this, it's not as simple as saying A equals B. Sometimes it's A equals B and then so like what in one scenario could be a dependent variable could be an independent variable as your model becomes complex. And your model, what I mean by a model, in case I sound abstract, I mean your conceptual model. So what you understand to be the influence of this on this, you can sketch it just how you would in any diagram. I think people are very familiar with these schematics, but that's really it. Whether it's horizontal, vertical, it's another story altogether, because it could look different. Because like if you look at people who are doing structural equation models, that's something completely different. It's not something you can just do in SPSS, because SPSS only limits you to one dependent variable. So if you're going to, you'll have to use SCSS that uses AMOS. And that's where you now start looking at what is it, factor loading, stuff like that. So we're trying to understand if we're saying this particular construct measures time, does it actually do so well? Does this question in the survey, question 1.7, for example, does it answer, does it measure time well? Does it measure what it says it measures well? So you begin a whole process of elimination from there. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense at this point, but like it gets more complicated as your question becomes more layered, because then you have to factor in a lot of things. But essentially, that's really the relationship. It's a question of how complex do you want to make it. For an honors project, a master's project, honestly, don't make it too complex. You're not trying to save the world. A lot of people will tell you that like your thesis or dissertation is going to save the world. No, it's not. Okay, let's be honest. It's not going to save the world. You're writing something that's useful. It's useful knowledge, but it's not something that's going to translate, that might translate to something immediately. You know, I'm not trying to be cynical, but just trying to say like, be pragmatic in your approach. Okay, we have someone in government now, as we were saying, as Ito was saying earlier, or Mr. Benjamin, he himself will tell you that the systems that they have in government are trying to establish relationships between one thing and the other so that they can inform their decisions. But it's not something that you can just write in your dissertation and automatically tomorrow it saves lives. So for purposes of what you're doing, be pragmatic about time. You want to finish on time. You want to do something that's useful, at least in contributing to existing bodies of knowledge, but you're not trying to say, hey, you're not trying to say, hey, you know, like I'm Professor whoever. No, be pragmatic. That's what I would advise. Sorry, I'm being long-winded, but that's my answer. Yeah, I don't know. Is that useful?
I'll just have a follow-up on that. But before I say that, I wish I had had those things before I did my. That's why I'm saying I wish I could turn back the hands of time, because in my master's research, I think I wanted to save the world, and that was strenuous on me, and that almost impacted my my output of research, because I wanted a research when they say that it saved the world. But anyway, I'm glad that I was able
to.
Yeah. So just to get you correctly, Khanya, you're saying, I'm trying to help people that, because I know that people who are inclined to quantitative research that might use a lot of variables. So I'm trying to just see if I'm understanding you correctly when you're speaking about independent and dependent variables. So you're looking at teachers and the allocation of time. So time will be an independent variable. And then you're looking at
that's correct.
What else would
look at outcomes? So in this case, instructional
so time is independent.
Right. So instructional time would be your independent variable, and then your dependent variable would now be the outcomes of learners. So how time is distributed in classrooms for learning, how did that affect the results, basically? Whether they got a good grade or not, but you're trying to understand that relationship. Thank you for that question, because unless I said grade or whatever, sometimes it feels like something very abstract. Yeah, but that would be one example. I definitely invite people to kind of get into quantitative research. It's not as hard as people think it is, but obviously, like people who deal with numbers, they like to. It's important work. They do very important work, but let's not make other people feel as if they can't, which is what happens with a lot of people who do the stuff. That's why I'm saying that conventions are very straightforward. If you can find a really good study that exemplifies what you're trying to do, you can emulate that, right? And a lot of people shy away from this because they feel like they need to do groundbreaking research. No. Rediscovering the ordinary is something that's an essential part of research. Rediscovering the ordinary, in the words of Professor Njabulo Ndebele in his book. But I feel like that's one message I'd say, for people, as also learning the ropes, because there's very few people who can translate their honors or master's research into the life's work, So, but find something you're passionate about, find an article that you feel has done it well, and emulate that. And then as you move along, you could be more inventive with what you do, That's what I would advise to people. That's a more pragmatic approach, honestly.
Okay. We have a question from Imran. And Imran is asking, is there difference between research hypothesis and research question?
There's a difference. So the difference is that with a hypothesis it's more of a quantitative research approach, right? So you're already assuming certain relationships between things. That's what a hypothesis really is. So you're saying, if time allocation is, and I'll go back to that example again. I don't know, I keep going back to it, but if time allocation is used well in the classroom, then it's going to positively impact learners' grades at the end of the semester, the end of the term, whatever. You get what I'm saying? That you use in quantitative research. So a lot of people who do structural equation modeling, for example, would use several, not just one hypothesis, but several. But you say for each layer of variables you're investigating and trying to understand. Let's say, for example, you're looking at 4 independent variables and you're trying to understand how they impact one particular variable, which is in this case would be learners' outcomes. So beyond looking at time, you say you also want to understand how distribution of resources, if that's a variable, whatever other variables you're thinking, then you're looking at 4 independent variables. So for the first one and its impact on outcomes, on grades, that's a hypothesis. Second one is your second hypothesis. Your third hypothesis. A question like a hypothesis guides your research. So it's a question of which paradigm you're kind of looking at things. In qualitative research, we don't talk about hypothesis. You just have a question guiding your research. That's the short answer. That's the short answer. If you're doing qualitative research, you have no business talking hypothesis unless if you're referring to other studies, but no. Yeah.
Thank you, Imran, for that question, because
thank you. Yes, sorry.
It highlights something also, because again, there was this whole thing when I was doing my my master's around hypotheses and questions. What's your hypothesis? What are your questions? And I had chosen qualitative research, and I didn't know that I had no business in trying to understand or trying to draft my own hypothesis on the side, because I already had questions. And which is, that's why I say I appreciate that you try and touch on things that we're not going to find on the textbook, but that are really important. And second last question that we have is, okay, there are different methods that I use. There's case study, there's ethnography, there's interviews and different influences
Sure.
you on the type of method you use? Like, what is the one thing that influences on the choice, or what should I look at when I'm choosing my method of, okay, I want to do a case study here, or maybe I want to do ethnography or interview. What is it that I'm looking at in making that decision?
Okay. I'll first start up by saying, you know, ethnographies take a while. So it's not something like, given the length of someone who's doing honors or masters. Yeah, no. I mean, obviously at a master's level, you're trying to demonstrate that we can operationalize a research project from beginning to end, you know? And for the most part, you'll get a good grading just from being able to demonstrate that, not how powerful your argument is and so forth. I mean, obviously those things are taken into consideration, but the main thing is, from a very practical point of view, like, do you know what research is? Can you do it systematically? Even if you float here and there, but like, that's really the main thing. But with an ethnography, like, ethnography is by nature, like, it's you're sitting in the field for a while. You know, I'd say minimum a year. Minimum a year. Like, I mean, there's debates about that, but like, for someone who's a student, unless if you're trying to produce a manuscript, and you start from your first year, you know, you really have to present a convincing argument to your research committee why you should be going for that particular method. You know, there's people who've done it, but it's also sometimes people who are latching on to the work that their supervisors have done, you know, and they're given more credit because they're going to do a lot of the analytical work that goes into it. They're going to be given a chunk of it to use as part of the research. But like, that's more longitudinal studies, you know. But case studies, you see it quite often in a lot of people's dissertations, people saying a case of. What I will say is that not everything needs to be a case study. You can just say, instructional time at a former Model C school in a peri-urban area in Cape Town or whatever, you know, and then you say what it is. You kind of let people know, where is this happening? Who are we dealing with, right? You know, you're dealing with schools that are supposedly highly resourced. You get what I'm saying? So you don't have to say it's a case study, because a case study has its own method. You have to convince people why it's a case, first of all. So in this case, if you're saying you're looking at, let's say you're looking at the issue of language in education. You're looking at a school in rural areas, but that's using English, right? Like Nkanduli, we had a case like that in Nkanduli village, you know, where they changed the language policy, and then later on, I don't know, I think they changed it again. But the main thing is, within that time, how is that going to affect learning? So you want to use it as a case study, because one of the things that research in linguistics, particularly with a particular focus on education, has shown is that, like, for people who are learning another language, they need to be in an environment that's highly resourced in their mother tongue and in the other language, and they need to have people around them who are speaking that language. So that's what made it an interesting case. So even just to make the case for it, it was easy, you know? So you can't just say everything case study of which is a very common practice, but it's not correct. Actually, people who do research methods will tell you it's not correct. There's a particular method. You have to have a case. Are you comparing? What are you doing? You know, you don't just say because you're in a particular, because research in its nature is place bound. You know, I can't say because I'm in Stech Spray, it's a case of Stech Spray. You must tell us why is it a unique case, you know? So that's what I would say to people, like looking at those particular things. I feel like those are the two main things to emphasize with case studies and ethnographies. I can't remember what your other examples were, but I feel like those are the main things to think about if you think of going any one of those directions.
No, just to do a follow-up, the question I was having was, as I was making those examples, is what influences me as a researcher? I'm asking this because
Oh,
otherwise,
okay.
in
Right.
our honors
So,
and masters, we just choose a method. But what do I look at? Okay, and say, for example, you said when you're looking at your research methodology, your questionnaires are important. Now, when I'm choosing the method to use, what is it exactly that I'm looking at and saying, because of these are the things, or this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is the best method to have.
right. I go back again to it's your question and what you're researching. So that's why I made the case study, like I made the example of language, you see, because in the case when we decided to make Mkanduli, the school in Mkanduli, a case study, is because they changed the language policy. The kids are all black, teachers are all black, rural areas. And it's very common in rural areas to, like, you don't have a library between where the school is and where home is. Some do, it's not like there's one typology of rural areas, but like the point is that, like, in terms of what research around language acquisition has taught people, you need to be in a highly resourced environment in the language that you're trying to get learners to learn. You need to have people as well who can demonstrate to them the use of that language, the command of that language. You know what I'm saying? So in this case, because there was a change in the language policy, they were saying, no, as a seven-sis course, and you're going to teach English. Okay. Are the resources there? Are there all these? So that's what made it a case study. It was a unique case, and you could make the case for it. So it's the circumstances around what we're trying to understand, but also where the literature is guiding us. Also the question. So these are some of the things you need to consider. So I hope that's clear in addressing your question. So it's your question, but also the
what you're trying to research. No, I think you've made it very clear now, into what influences one's the research. Something that has been mentioned quite often, but I've never really got a accurate explanation. People speak a lot about triangulation. If you, with the bit of time that we have, can you please explain what that means? And also, at first you touch a bit on the use of mixture of quantitative and qualitative. And I would love if you would just give us some scenarios of how does that work out, and in what situations would it be more probable that a person will use a mixed methodology?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, okay, so I mean, like, we've already covered the fact that, you're looking at two different paradigms, right? But also their worldview are different. One is looking at observable measures. The other one is looking at meanings people ascribe to a particular phenomenon, depending on what you're interested in, right? So to go into triangulation, to go into mixed method means that, first of all, and this is why I was saying the approach I would advise people to use is because the conventions of quantitative research are so straightforward, right? You can start there and see what relationships are people looking at, right? What scales are they using? So the questions in the survey, for example, how much depth can they actually get into? Because remember, people are using scales because these scales, like I said at the beginning, say you're part of a community that has already built bodies of knowledge. These scales have been developed over time, and they're set to measure certain constructs, right? So whether it's time usage in class and its impact on learner outcomes, right? The scales for that, they're already established. They will tell you it's reliable when it's at this percentage, and so forth and so forth. You can start from there and then say, these are the limitations of this particular approach, this quantitative approach using scales. It can tell us beyond assuming that, for example, let me go back to social media as an example again. Beyond assuming that, people are satisfied with it, because like if you look at some of that research, it's job satisfaction is an important part of social media usage. In the world we live in today, let's say I'm an introvert. I don't want being on social media. I don't want to be on Facebook, but my job requires, if my brother works in advertising, some of the work that they do involves going into Ngalo. Shout out, bro. So it just kind of, okay, anyway, like, but that's the kind of work they need to do. They need to go into Twitter, look at what people are saying, and they're doing this for clients. Maybe one of their clients is trying to understand, they're trying to tap into a particular demographic, right? So they're looking into these things, right? Without being too elaborate in this example, the point is that you can't assume that people use social media because they want to. It has to do maybe with this, incentive that comes with the work that they do. Maybe the job performance is based off the fact that they have to use social media. Are they using it? But they personally themselves wouldn't want to use it. You get what I'm saying? So these are assumptions that underlie these scales. So now, as someone who's coming from a qualitative research perspective, you can problematize these assumptions, and then you can formulate questions that allow you to probe deeper into things that these scales can't. So that would be one reason for using mixed methods. I hope that example kind of, in very practical terms, exemplifies why you would want to do that. So you want to do that to draw out beyond the obviousness of, yes, I strongly agree that I use social media at work, but now when you sit with the person, you ask them, they can problematize the underlying assumptions of these scales and show you why they're actually using social media beyond the obviousness of these questionnaires and the predetermined boxes that people have to tick. So that's one reason why you would want to use mixed methods. You want to peel the onion in ways that quantitative research, maybe you might find that people who've been doing these studies are predominantly people in quantitative research, and you trying to add a qualitative element to it, a qualitative distinction into why, these patterns exist of social media usage and so forth, but you want the meanings people ascribe to it. So you use mixed methods for that reason. And triangulation helps you to do it well, because like I said, a lot of people say they want to use mixed methods, but they don't do it well. So like I said, each of these paradigms have strengths and weaknesses. You use mixed methods to compensate for the weaknesses of one method using the strength of the other. So that's why I use triangulation. I hope that brings it 360.
It does. I'm sitting here, I'm like, finally, there's an understanding into why the use, and obviously it'll be influenced by the study you want to, and I think the study of social media really paints out the picture of what one would like to achieve. And with that, Kanye, I'm happy that we've already had the conversation prior to this. So people that are watching, we're gonna have another session on coding, and he mentioned SPSS, there are different kinds. And when I was met with SPSS, it was a tough one. And I must also tell the story. It was taught by a Chinese teacher. So it was a
okay.
It was a disaster. Yeah. It was a disaster. You can't ask me anything about SPSS because that was a disaster from the word go. But we're going to have more sessions around research techniques. 2 weeks back we had on on literature review, and I love that it's followed by a research methodology. And we're still going to have more to people that are watching.
Yeah.
Yes, we're having a systole, the literature review. So basically, we're just trying to equip people with research and just ease their anxiety, because there's a lot of anxiety around research. I mean, for myself, if I had the things you told us today, I think my anxiety levels would have at least dropped by 40% or so,
Yeah.
because the whole research spectrum, I think a lot of people have stereotypes, stigmas around it because of how the academia world is structured, and people always shy away. You will see on social media how people talk about academias, and whether it's in dating, whether it's in friendship, in whatever spectrum, everyone is just like, can I stay away from anyone who's into academia work? So I think it's also the animal on it's painted in a different aspect, and a lot of people, I think a lot of people who could contribute to research are shying away from research because it seems just to be too hard. Like, for example, the mixed methods, the quantitative research, people are always just fearful that they will never be able to finish whatever they're supposed to do, because of the stereotype, the stigmas around that. And with this platform, we're trying to ease people's fears and actually give a face to research as something that is relatable to anyone, and something that we do on an everyday basis, that whether I'm at work or where I need to do research for whatever I need to do, and there are techniques to it. So thank you very much, Kanye, for coming through. And I know that you're gonna come through again. So this is not our last encounter with you here at the Young Researchers Hub. We're going to have more sessions, and thank you to everyone who's been tuning in since the beginning of this platform. And to anyone who wants to look at some of the conversation we had, we have it on YouTube. You just search Young Researchers Hub. We've saved every conversation we've had. We've done what is research. We've done literature review. We've done interviews with people on their research. Some have explained why they chose a certain method, a certain theoretical framework. So you will also see how people are choosing. Yeah, you will also see how people are choosing their theoretical frameworks, how they're structuring their questions on a practical way. That's why we're also having the interviews with people around their research. So you're welcome to go and watch. You're welcome to rewind, write down, rewind, go back, and until you get the concept. Hence the questions, the follow-up questions, and the fact that we also always want our presenters to have examples so that a person can imagine what they're talking about. And I thank you, Kanye, for all the examples you gave us, because it's something that is really relatable, that we can always look at. And from us here at the Hub, we thank you for your time. We thank you for tuning in. Please social distance, sanitize, wear your mask, make a decision around whether you want to vaccinate or not, and why you're doing that, why you're choosing that. I don't want people to find themselves in a position where they following things, theories. Do your own research, please. There've been a lot of flying around the whole pandemic issue, the whole vaccine and everything. There are a lot of theories. So please do your research, and I hope to see you next time when having another session.
From my side, from Tech Spread. People are holding cameras in my face just so that Nukazun Bona guys. Says Lalini. I have a strong team of very lovely people here with me. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for the opportunity. We'll talk again. I'm on social media, Khanyisile, Ngalo. People can reach out to me if they have other questions. I do research coaching there as well. But like you said, we can talk further on issues related to coding and so forth. But thank you so much for the platform, to the audience as well, for being engaging, both on Facebook and on Zoom. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Be responsible.
Thank you very much. To the team that has made this on your side possible. I thank them very much, because we're both worried about what's going to happen. And to that theme, to that tune, thank you very much, guys. You've made this. This is a long-term impact. A lot of people are gonna keep watching this 5 months, 10 months down the line, and you make sure that we see Kanye and we're able to have this conversation. And for that, we thank you. And from our side, from the Young Researchers have a great weekend. Be responsible all the time. There's still a long journey ahead. Our country still needs soldiers who are going to do research and contribute to the research knowledge in this country as we decolonize, as we do everything else in between. We need people. So please be responsible, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.